Mine's fine.
Okay, I'll just take that away then.
Well, thank you so much for that lovely introduction, and I'm really very happy to be here. This is a wonderful occasion, and to be part of this lecture series is really quite a privilege and a pleasure for me. To start today thinking about the topic of this talk, science fiction and the project of posthumanist science in the context of cultural studies, I want to begin in the space of cultural studies and recall for us where the concept of the posthumanist condition begins, where this term comes from. In 1977, the cultural theorist Ihab Hassan reflected upon the intensification of techno-scientific ambition in the 20th century, a newfound urgency for instrumental access to the innermost molecular depths as well as the cosmic reaches. He characterized this urgency as driven by the widespread convergence of imagination and science, myth and technology, language and number, a convergence that he identified with the figure of Prometheus. This historical intensification of Prometheanism for Hassan represented not merely a quantitative change, but a qualitative one, with nothing less at stake than the future of the human as such. If the ancient myths of Prometheus have effectively allegorized the invention of the human, the primordial technicity of human nature, and the entanglement of anthropogenesis with technogenesis, Hassan would no doubt have agreed with Bernard Stiegler's analysis of these issues. The resurgence of Promethean vision in late modernity instead suggested a transformation in the self-fashioning of human history, a materialist transcendence of the limits of terrestrial life that Hassan, with notable irony, ventured to call post-human. Quote, "We need first to understand that the human form, including human desire and all its external representations, may be changing radically and thus must be revisioned. We need to understand that 500 years of humanism may be coming to an end as humanism transforms itself into something that we must helplessly call posthumanism." To whatever degree something like posthumanism began to emerge and characterize certain modes of technoscientific and philosophical thought over the last half-century, it was, and this is what I want to argue tonight, significantly, if not entirely, indebted to the genre of science fiction. Certainly, this history has been exhaustively documented elsewhere, and it's not my intention to remap it here. Rather, what I want to suggest is the extent to which posthumanist projections have emerged in relationship to the discourse of science fiction, the extent to which technoscientific programs to remake the capacities of human flesh have explicitly or implicitly drawn on the conceptual resource of science fiction. It was already anticipated, enacted, and performed within the narratives of science fiction itself. This, of course, has something to do with the proliferation of actual narratives of posthumanization in the history of science fiction, from the evolutionary futures of H.G. Wells and Olaf Stapledon to the post-biological visions of cyberpunk and beyond. But more significantly, I suggest that it owes to a certain recursive tendency in science fiction as a narrative genre and a mode of cultural discourse, a formal preposterousness or preposterity that characterizes science fiction as a way of thinking. But we're not there yet. To get where we're going, we need to take a step back. To see things more acutely, let's focus on an example, say, one of the figures that Hassan pointed to as indexing the new Promethean moment, the advent of posthumanist culture. Hassan cites the physicist Gerald Feinberg, in particular, Feinberg's vision for a global Prometheus project, as typifying a certain kind of transcendental yearning in the fields of science and technology. But it is important to consider the broader context of Feinberg's research in theoretical physics to better appreciate the ways in which science-fictional modes of thought have shaped the project of posthumanist science, and the ways in which science fiction has constructed its own relationship to the governance of futurity. In 1967, Feinberg published a quantum field analysis of a purely hypothetical class of faster-than-light particles that he dubbed tachyons. This was a rather unorthodox research project, to say the least. While the possibility of objects moving at superluminal velocities had been considered since the late 19th century, the impact of Einstein's 1905 special theory of relativity seemed to put further study of faster-than-light speed into the realm of pure science fiction. According to special relativity, it would require infinite energy to accelerate an object with real mass up to the speed of light. In other words, as Einstein himself put it, superluminary velocities have no possibility of existence. Even were it possible to transmit signals faster than light, such transmissions would appear to some observers as having traveled backwards in time, introducing the uncanny possibility of information from the future influencing past events. Not only would this violate the principles of physical causality, it could also lead to certain paradoxes. For example, if messages were to arrive before they were sent and preempt the sender from sending them. Special relativity therefore seemed to squash any fantasies of faster-than-light travel and backwards communication from the future, at least in the zones of serious science. But in 1962, the physicists Marian Beleniuk, V.K. Deshpande, and George Sudarshan postulated the existence of subatomic particles that always travel at superluminal velocities. Such meta-particles would never confront the speed of light as an upper barrier because they would be already beyond it. Moreover, the problem of temporal paradoxes could be solved by relativistic reinterpretation, insofar as observers in some frames of reference would perceive such a particle, quote, not as a weird negative energy particle traveling backward in time, but as a positive energy particle traveling forward in time, but going in the opposite direction. Likewise, any apparent violations of causality could be reinterpreted as causal events, a matter of perspective. Feinberg, a professor at Columbia University since 1959, was fascinated by this possibility. Encouraged by his successful prediction of the muon neutrino in 1958, its existence was later demonstrated in 1962, Feinberg took up the question of faster-than-light particles with a bold territorial move. He named them. Rendering them as objects of relativistic quantum field theory, figuring them as excitations of a quantum field with imaginary mass, Feinberg also conjured them as objects of discourse. One description is presented, he writes, for non-interacting faster-than-light particles, which we call tachyons. Shortly afterwards, in a Scientific American article introducing tachyons to a wider audience, Feinberg highlighted the strategic nature of this maneuver. In anticipation of the possible discovery of faster-than-light particles, I named them tachyons, from the Greek word tachys, meaning swift. Feinberg's philological and theoretical production of these speculative objects ahead of time, I venture, represents a science-fictional way of doing science, a way of staking claims on the future. After all, Feinberg was known as much for his intense love of science fiction as for his prodigious talent as a physicist. When he passed away in 1992, the obituaries described him as, quote, a devoted scientist and an avid science fiction fan. And sure enough, his work on tachyons was to some degree indebted to his reading of science fiction. As the physicist and science fiction writer Gregory Benford recalled, quote, he told me years later that he had begun thinking about tachyons because he was inspired by James Blish's short story, Beep. In it, a faster-than-light communicator plays a crucial role in a future society. The communicator necessarily allows sending of signals backward in time. Feinberg had set out to see if such a gadget was theoretically possible. While Blish's 1954 story no doubt piqued Feinberg's curiosity, I want to suggest that its value for Feinberg's own work was less in its technical provocations than its literary ones. For Beep affords an understanding of theoretical science as equivalent to science fiction, not a purveyor of mere flights of fancy, but a generator of consequential fictions with the capacity to produce the circumstances of their own actualization. In other words, they are fictions that become the conditions of possibility, the enabling contexts for discovery and innovation. Blish's text unfolds as a story within a story. The framing device is a narrative that focuses on the governmental organization known as the Service, responsible for overseeing the smooth advancement of galactic civilization. This massive interplanetary operation depends on the technology of the Dirac communicator. Any message sent through one Dirac communicator is received simultaneously by all the others, preceded by a small beep of sound. In the nested story concerning the origins of this communicator, the video commentator Dana Lee discovers that, quote, the beep is the simultaneous reception of every one of the Dirac messages which have ever been sent or ever will be sent. The narrative symbolically aligns Lee's discovery with lies and illusions, the fictive as such. Her disclosure of the beep's meaning depends on an elaborate charade where she poses as a man named J. Shelby Stevens. On the other hand, Robin Weinbaum, the director of the service, is fully aligned with the regime of truth. He represents a government that does not tolerate fiction. He tells her, just in case you're not aware of the fact, there are certain laws relating to giving false information to a security officer, plus various local laws against transvestitism, pseudonymity, and so on. Weinbaum demands transparency. He likewise insists on stripping any obscuring noise from otherwise pure signals. He instructs his assistant to excise the beep. Margaret, next time you send any Dirac tapes in here, cut that damnable beep off them first. Weinbaum, agent of truth and law, disregards this literally preposterous noise. Its meaning only comes to light through Lee's fictive performances. Lee's process of extracting discrete transmission from the beep is an interpretive practice described as reading. She says, I can read the future in detail. Her method apprehends the faster-than-light messages as texts, many of which are strange, mystifying, and unnerving. She says, once you know, however, that when you use the Dirac you're dealing with time, you can coax some very strange things out of the instrument. Yet these strange things are recognized as consistent with reality, explicable by scientific logic, which is to say, they have the qualities of science fiction. She paused and smiled. I have heard, she said conversationally, the voice of the president of our galaxy in 3480 announcing the federation of the Milky Way and the Magellanic Clouds. I've heard the commander of a world line cruiser traveling from 8873 to 8704 along the world line of the planet Hathsaba, which circles a star on the rim of NGC 4725, calling for help across 11 million light years. But what kind of help he was calling for, or will be calling for, is beyond my comprehension, and many other things. When you check on me, you'll hear these things too, and you'll wonder what many of them mean. These vignettes draw from a common repertoire of science fiction tropes: enormous spaceships, intergalactic civilizations, time travel, and they body forth a sense of wonder and wonderment. Weinbaum, already feeling a little dizzy, wanted only scenes and voices, more scenes and voices from the future. They were better than aquavit. Alluring and bewildering, they evade full rational comprehension, even while indicating that such comprehension is possible or will be someday. Dana says, the farther into the future you travel with the machine, the more incomprehensible the messages become. And so you're reduced to telling yourself that time will, after all, have to pass by at its own pace before enough of the surrounding events can emerge to make those remote messages clear. The effect of these weird messages from the future is instead a new perception of the present, namely as the historical context for incredible changes to come. Viewing a beep transmission of a green-skinned face of something that looked like an animated traffic signal with a helmet on it, Weinbaum exclaims, and we'll be using non-humanoids there. What was that creature anyhow? Weinbaum sees the alien as his own future, albeit radically estranged. The surprising future puts the present in a new light, exposing the humanist biases of the present, looked like an animated traffic signal, even as it suggests the possibility for things to be otherwise. The beep is therefore a figure for science fiction as such. While Lee's method, as she calls it, of reading the future, understands the beep messages to represent inevitable events, evidence for seemingly a perfectly acausal universe, she nevertheless interprets them as self-fulfilling prophecies. Taking the beep messages seriously, Lee cooks up reason, she says, to ensure that they will take place. She invents fictions of causality, or what she calls rationalizations, that become indistinguishable from actual causes. It is a method of reading the future that the service then implements as policy. In the framing narrative, hundreds of years later, serviceman Krasna says, our interests as a government depend upon the future. We operate as if the future is as real as the past, and so far we haven't been disappointed. The service is 100% successful. Our obligation as event police is to make the events of the future possible, because those events are crucial to our society. This as-if approach does not draw a hard line between fact and theory, truth and lies, science and science fiction. The service accepts the beep messages as if they were reliable prophecies, but treats them in practice as speculative forecasts that might fail without a vast technoscientific infrastructure designed to, quote, make the events of the future possible. In its role as event police, the service assembles numerous technical resources. The servicemen say, we have some foreknowledge, of course, but we have other obvious advantages, genetics, for instance, and operations research, the theory of games, the Dirac transmitter. It's quite an arsenal, and of course, there's a good deal of prediction involved in all of those things. Even with knowledge of things to come, the service marshals the tools of various scientific disciplines to turn speculations and as-if scenarios into lived events. Now, all of this, you might note, represents an explicitly constructivist approach to truth, a model for the generation of scientific knowledge that does not excise science fiction in the way that Weinbaum had so casually excised the beep, but rather upholds its crucial role for the advancement of science and society. To the degree that it represents a science fictional way of governing the future, the appeal of beep to a devoted scientist and avid science fiction fan, like Jerry Feinberg, seems obvious in retrospect. The service's decision to reinterpret causally uncertain events in a causal way, sidestepping potential paradoxes, is tantalizingly similar to the principle of reinterpretation developed in Feinberg's own work in theoretical physics. According to Feinberg, actual instrumentation for detecting the absorption of tachyons from the future would make distinctions between emission and absorption, sending and receiving, undecidable. Inclined to causal explanations, any observer would therefore naturally describe the tachyon detector as if it were spontaneously sending signals forward rather than receiving them from the future. For the same reason, Feinberg suggested that a device such as the Dirac communicator in the story, if taken literally, would not be possible. The relevance of beep for thinking about tachyons, however, is more figural. For the story presents a model of scientific practice and technological governance that treats physical theories and interpretations of data as fictions, but not mere fictions. Rather, the Dirac messages become the conditions for further experiments, triggering additional research and decisive actions. They are science fictions that enable their own materialization in the form of consequential practices. Feinberg offered a similar perspective in his writings on tachyons. This is from one of his technical articles. Having convinced ourselves that the existence of faster-than-light particles does not imply any contradiction of relativity, we must nevertheless leave the determination of whether such objects really happen in nature to the experimental physicist. Feinberg here presents tachyons as consequential fictions that galvanize experiments, no more, no less. To be sure, they have provoked numerous studies and experiments over the last half-century. Even failure to prove their existence has led to new theoretical interpretations. For example, we could point to the tachyonic field concept in quantum field theory, taken to mathematically indicate field instabilities rather than real particles. We could also point to the abiding hope for faster-than-light signals, a hope projected always into the future. It's still going to happen, as suggested in some recent research on quantum tunneling, or more tellingly, in the premature 2011 declaration by scientists at CERN that they had discovered neutrinos traveling faster than light, and this was a claim that was later disproved. Yet even as they generate such experimental adventures, tachyons have not ceased to be understood as science-fictional objects. Already in 1970, Feinberg conceded that the experimental results seemed to suggest that tachyons are not actually real. But to him, this only further demonstrated the value of such entities. After all, as he said, it may be likely that tachyons simply do not exist. But we may not understand why it should be so until we reach a much deeper understanding of the nature of elementary particles than now exists. Which is to say, as nothing otherwise than science fictions, they indicate the degree to which extant physical theories are themselves provisional and constructed, prone to change in the future. This forward-looking perspective also led Feinberg to propose an ambitious global endeavor that he called the Prometheus Project. He set out the dimensions of this proposal in his 1968 book, The Prometheus Project: Mankind's Search for Long-Range Goals, and he continued to develop these ideas over the following decade, reiterating them in his 1977 book, Consequences of Growth: The Prospects for a Limitless Future. The Prometheus project was to be a scheme for reshaping social organization in order to achieve futuristic science fiction visions. In effect, Feinberg proposed establishing an event police, governing the future in the image of science fiction. In his books, Feinberg imagines a widespread democratic process involving stakeholders from all over the world deliberating a variety of long-range future scenarios to help our species decide which socio-technical pathways should be followed and which ones should be avoided, which ones will be beneficial and which ones will be catastrophic. He writes, quote, "The purpose of this book is to propose a group effort, which I call the Prometheus Project, from the Greek word Prometheus, meaning foresight." We see how he likes etymologies. "By which humanity can choose its goals. In that way, humanity would move closer to becoming the shaper of its own destiny," end quote. The necessity of such a project, according to Feinberg, is entailed by the entangled accelerations of globalization and technologization, which indicate that certain choices we make today about science, technology, and society might prove to be world-shaking decisions, as he calls them, with irreversible effects. He points to the risks already posed by nuclear technologies and the global climate effects of industrial pollution as known instances of such world-shaking decisions, arguing that even more profound eventualities are on the way. He writes, "In the future, technological possibilities will grow to the point where individuals or small groups could take actions that would result in a radical transformation of human life." He argues, quote, "The advent of world-shaking decisions thus calls for some kind of long-range planning on the future of mankind. Otherwise, man, having elevated himself through his technology from being the plaything of blind nature, might become the victim of blind actions on his own part," end quote. Such long-range planning would involve collective assessment of various as-if scenarios, technological and scientific developments that might prove to profoundly change society, the natural environment, or human biology as such. It would mean committing as a global society to certain goals, affirmatively answering the question which he poses as, should we, the people alive today, bind the people of the future to our own purposes, and can we do so? He answers yes. Necessarily speculative, such a massive project would, according to Feinberg, benefit tremendously from drawing on one of our best resources for assessing the future impacts and potentialities of new and emerging technoscientific innovations, namely science fiction. It is unfortunate, Feinberg writes, that these imaginative writings have not been given much serious attention, he says, since they are not only a fertile source of suggestions for goals, but often point out unexpected implications that the attainment of some goals might have for human life. End quote. Among the many as-if futures presenting themselves with particular intensity in science fiction as much as in actual scientific research, Feinberg especially noted the unprecedented possibilities of re-engineering the human body and human behavioral patterns afforded by the emerging instruments of biotechnology and cognitive science. Quote, "Human nature is therefore not something unalterable, but can be changed," end quote. He cites several science fiction novels, including Olaf Stapledon's Last and First Men, A. Van Vo's Slan, Jack Williamson's Dragon's Island, and many others, as providing insightful assessments of these issues, helping to frame the scope of further developments. But Feinberg repeatedly asserts that our capacities to speculate and deliberate on the option of changing man if we choose, as he puts it, and to anticipate even a small fraction of the social, ecological, and evolutionary ramifications entailed by this choice are circumscribed in advance, limited by human nature itself. Human, all too human. For this reason, the Prometheus project proves to be a self-reflexive, critical assessment of human being, the constitutive finitude of humanness that prevents us from seeing much beyond our own presentist horizon. As Feinberg writes, quote, "The most serious fault in the human condition lies in our finitude. We are conscious beings aware of our own limitations. Two of the most important of these are the lack of power to do things we want to do and the specter of impending death, which always threatens to put an end to all of our thinking and doing," end quote. The difficulties of securing a sustainable, desirable future then ultimately reduce to the limits of human agency and foresight, the blinders of short-term thinking imposed by the span of a single human lifetime, which encourage us to put unforeseen problems of present decisions onto future generations. According to Feinberg, the solution is to overcome these so-called ends of man. This would first mean mobilizing our best science and technology towards the elimination of death as an obstacle, and he suggests we must take steps towards indefinite life and indefinite youth. But merely eliminating death as a natural human limit would not solve the seemingly more intractable problem of the metaphysics of presence, or what Feinberg calls the, quote, temporal provincialism inherent in most human thought. So we must go further to overcome not only the condition of being towards death, but also being as presence. Feinberg, quote, perhaps the only true solution to the problem of death is to eliminate it for those who do not desire it. But even at death's end, men will remain finite beings in their accomplishments, if not in their expectations. So some other kind of reconstruction of man appears called for to deal with finitude. It calls for the complete reconstitution of the human, it seems, beyond humanism and its ends. Feinberg writes, quote, the most radical proposals along these lines would be that man should reconstruct his biological and psychological nature so that the present faults in his condition are corrected. If this road is chosen, it means that we will have accepted the fact that not only is non-human nature subject to man's will in how it is to function, but that man has the choice of what he himself is to be. Such an attitude is perhaps the logical extension of setting goals for humanity, end quote. The end of the human in all its senses, already now at the beginning. While conceding that others may reasonably disagree, Feinberg nevertheless ventures that posthumanization is a logical extension of extending our foresight into the long-term future. In other words, it is inherent to the Prometheus project itself. For the social necessity of engaging in widespread deliberation of the normative question of whether we ought to re-engineer ourselves, whether to commit ourselves to the biological reconstruction of the human race, leads to the conclusion that we must do so if we are to have any hope of grappling with the profound implications of our emerging technical powers. The posthumanization of mankind becomes already inevitable, recursively transposed on the present. The as-if future destines itself, secured by the forces of the Prometheus project and its stakeholders, who will effectively become the event police. Feinberg writes, quote, more than ever before, we have the power to determine the future rather than to predict it, end quote. Yet vigilant policing, it seems, would prove unnecessary, for once begun, this imagined future becomes self-reinforcing. And here's a bit of a long quote. Feinberg, if mankind is transformed through conscious biological manipulation, the new men that are produced will have a different set of interests and potentialities than we do. In making this change, we will therefore have started on a road that could not easily be retraced, not because the biological manipulation could not be undone, but because the new man is not likely to want to reintroduce the attributes of contemporary man in himself. Hence, biological engineering is likely to lead to some of the irreversible changes that we have been discussing. End quote. To the degree that it advances a radical vision of re-engineering human biology and behavior, it participates in a discourse of post-humanist science that goes back to J.B.S. Haldane's Daedalus, or Science in the Future, J.D. Bernal's The World, the Flesh, and the Devil, and other scientific contributions to the Today and Tomorrow series in the 1920s and 1930s. But Feinberg's posthumanist science is not limited to the specificity of his technical vision to change mankind. Rather, what I want to show here is that his project of setting forth science fiction scenarios as futuristic goals that preemptively transform the present represents a posthumanist temporalization that reorders the classical relations of the present and the future, and thereby disorients the temporal coevolution of technogenesis and anthropogenesis, to anticipate the model of Simondon and Stiegler, which now appears to move backwards rather than forwards, or rather its temporal frame of reference becomes undecidable. To see how this works, let's consider Feinberg's discussion of the, quote, expansion of human consciousness. He writes, in a sense, developmental and transcendent goals might be regarded as successive stages in a process of going from where man is now to what he will become. But this may not be the order of things in which things will or should be done. The formulation, he says, of transcendent goals is difficult because the lack of models makes it hard to imagine what conditions would really be like in the new situation. Consider, he says, for example, the proposal that men would be much better off if they all shared a common consciousness, perhaps through something like an artificial telepathic communication system. While it is possible to describe this in words and perhaps even carry out the plan, it is very difficult to feel intuitively what life would be like for those who lived under these conditions." End quote. So as Feinberg says, while it might seem that this idea is about extending a developmental program, a prosthesis of the human present into the future, gradually turning imagination into actuality in linear historical time, the situation is quite otherwise. For to whatever degree it is possible to, quote, carry out the plan of developing a technology to create a human hive mind, the actual experience of such collective consciousness cannot be known in advance. It is science fiction, an as-if scenario. Certainly, Feinberg reminds us that science fiction writers such as Olaf Stapledon have presented robust narrative accounts of what an expansion of human consciousness beyond its native boundaries could be like. Yet it remains inscrutable, Feinberg tells us, to merely human minds. So even if we read about it in science fiction, Feinberg says, we still can't really understand what it would actually be like, because we're merely human. All we can know now is that the actuality of radically expanded consciousness would profoundly change us. Indeed, it would have effects that we cannot foresee even when contemplating the goal with all of its fictive qualities. As Feinberg says, we have the power to determine this future rather than predict it. The event police can only operate through the logic of the as-if, of course. Yet for precisely this reason, namely, that it would be a world-shaking decision with irreversible consequences, the pursuit of such a goal requires us to change ourselves already in advance, to think beyond our own limits and pre-adapt ourselves to what is to come. Quote, Feinberg, "The time scale of a few centuries and the knowledge of where we are trying to go make it possible for us to adapt our social institutions to the situation when the new form of consciousness becomes a reality." So that is to say, we must preemptively reorganize society and ourselves for the future. And there's no time like the present, he suggests. Quote, "One of the things we could do very soon would begin thinking and planning for the kind of society that would need to go with the new forms of consciousness." End quote. So in this manner, the long-term future would appear not as the outgrowth of near-term developmental steps, but vice versa. This speculative future urgently solicits a reordering of society in such a way that the more specific goal of expanded consciousness becomes already inevitable. The consequential fiction of the human hive mind sets the conditions for its own actualization. The long-term goal is not the end, but rather the beginning. Or rather, cause and effect become undecidable, open to reinterpretation. And according to Feinberg, once we've reshaped our expectations in this way, actively preparing society for an imminent post-humanization that will have been, or rather has already begun, other projections open up as goals that were not seen in advance, but prove to have been inevitable all along, including, quote, "the extension of consciousness," Feinberg says, "to its logical limit when it becomes coextensive with the entire universe," end quote. That is to say, a limit that is unlimited, in excess of ends as such, or transfinite. For Feinberg, the goals we set are not ends, but rather preconditions for other modes of becoming that we cannot fully predict in advance, yet retrospectively become our destination. Our self-transforming through long-term speculation becomes an opening to futurity as such and all its radical potentiality. It is not a visioning program that sees the future as merely a prolongation or metastasis of the present, but instead a recursion of the future into the present that opens to alterity, and in this way aspires to overcome the failures of the human and its being towards limits. We might note, of course, that this accession of ends, as an onto-epistemological transformation of the human condition, parallels the structure of Feinberg's analysis of tachyons as particles already beyond the speed of light, already beyond the relativistic barrier that secures the classical principle of causality, and whose propagation backwards or forwards in time, as either cause or effect, is fundamentally undecidable. That's the point of the Feinberg reinterpretation principle. Hence, the reinterpretation principle that allows us to see future events as affecting the past only in the sense of the as-if. But this is not to say, once again, that James Blish simply underwrites Feinberg's posthumanist project, or at least, if it is, it's not James Blish alone. Rather, it is the entirety of science fiction as a genre which characteristically bodies forth a Prometheanism in advance of itself, a preposterous Prometheanism. In other words, science fiction as itself a Prometheus project, a projection of foresight beyond the present that becomes the precondition for looking backwards, looking inwards at ourselves preposterously without end. It is signaled, of course, by the particular mutations of the figure of Prometheus throughout the history of the genre, from the period of its purported origins, for example, Mary Shelley's Frankenstein or the modern Prometheus, through, more recently, Ridley Scott's film Prometheus, and so forth. But to see it in action, we can simply look at some of the texts that Feinberg cites in his own Prometheus project, either directly or indirectly. For example, Feinberg cites Van Vo's 1940 novel Slan, which is about superhuman mutants hiding among the normal human population. In this novel, the mere notion of a Slan-making machine, a hypothetical device for creating super mutants, actually accelerates the process of posthuman evolution, even though in the context of the plot, the Slan-making machine is purely a rumor, a speculation, nothing but science fiction. Yet it is a consequential fiction that produces the conditions for its realization. Or let's consider the work of Arthur C. Clarke. While Feinberg does not directly cite Clarke's fiction in the Prometheus project, he does repeatedly cite and discuss Clarke's 1962 non-fictional work about the accession of limits and ends, Profiles of the Future. Moreover, there are several moments where Feinberg considers the possibility of alien influences fostering our posthuman evolution, an idea that strongly echoes the narrative of Clarke's 1953 novel Childhood's End. When the Overlord ships arrive in Childhood's End, the event signals both recollection and prolepsis, both déjà vu and preview. This is quoting from Clarke. Quote, "There had been no warning when the great ships came pouring out of the unknown depths of space. Countless times this day had been described in fiction, but no one had really believed it would ever come. Now it had dawned at last. The gleaming, silent shapes hanging over every land were the symbol of a science that man could not hope to match for centuries," end quote. The arrival evidently represents a high-tech future incongruously transposed onto the human present, quote, "the symbol of a science that man could not hope to match for centuries," thus recalling an entire narrative genre conspicuously preoccupied with such events, quote, "Countless times this day had been described in fiction." The arrival of the overlords therefore symbolizes science fiction as such, a recursive figuration of science fiction with all its generic cliches as well as its conceptual innovations. Or to say it differently, the arrival of the overlords takes the form of science fiction itself. It is a science fictional event even within the diegesis of the novel. Furthermore, as the story unfolds, we see that the discourse of science fiction has prescripted the experience of so-called first contact. One character even rebukes another for holding preconceived notions about the overlords. Quote, "You've been reading too much science fiction." Even long after their arrival, the overlords continue to hide their true appearances from human eyes because they recognize that the entire history of mythic discourse, fantastical literature, folkloric and religious traditions, the prehistory of science fiction in its largest sense, has prejudiced the human species against them. For the overlords look like demons. Quote, "There was no mistake. The leathery wings, the little horns, the barbed tail, all were there. The most terrible of all legends had come to life out of the unknown past," end quote. Once the overlords reveal their true forms, a number of human scholars theorize that some horrific situation in ancient history, for example, an aboriginal encounter between the overlords and our ancestors, must account for the instinctual human fear of demonic figures. Yet the reality is more shocking. As it turns out, the appearance of the alien other in the long history of folkloric and mythic discourse does not record ancestral memory. Instead, it records futurity, a prescription or program of events yet to come. For the overlord's secret purpose is to shepherd the orthogenic evolution of Homo sapiens into something more than human, guiding social and biological conditions towards the emergence of the posthuman. The ancient fear of demonic figures and monstrous others, as recorded in the genealogy of fantastical literature, proves to have been a memory in reverse, a psychic and cognitive adjustment to the posthuman future. The human apperception of its own closure, the end of its childhood, has therefore been narrated since time immemorial. As the overlords explain, quote, "For that memory was not of the past, but of the future, of those closing years when your race knew that everything was finished. And because we were there, we became identified with your race's death. Yes, even while it was 10,000 years in the future. It was as if a distorted echo had reverberated round the closed circle of time from the future to the past," end quote. Fables of satanic possessions, monstrous births, and alien invasions prove to have been letters from the post-human future, though we do not recognize them as such. But as the psychoanalyst and philosopher Jacques Lacan famously asserted, a letter in sufferance always arrives at its destination. To be sure, the novelistic structure of childhood's end provides a human vantage point on the end of human being, its transmutation into something unspeakably other. Jan, the lone human witness to the ascension of post-humanity in the novel, remains on Earth even after the overlords themselves have fled to safety. He records his observations with a telephonic device, describing the final moments of a doomed planet in his own words, the last human narrator reporting from the edge of apocalypse. Jan's words are transmitted to the overlord ship, helping the aliens to imagine a post-human event that they cannot witness directly because they're fleeing from it. However, due to the time delay in relaying messages to the ship traveling at near light speed, the overlords receive Jan's transmission, his narration of the post-humanizing process, long after it has concluded, long after the last man himself has been absorbed by the transformative energies. Quote, "It was strange to think that the ships of the overlords were racing away from the Earth almost as swiftly as his signal could speed after it. Almost, but not quite. It would be a long chase, but his words would catch them." End quote. Time and again, the post-human narrative comes too late, always playing catch-up. Even when sent early, it becomes legible only after the fact. This is the inherent belatedness, the waywardness of the post. It looks backwards from a destination that it has not yet reached, addressing a future that has already taken place. If Feinberg's project of post-humanist science reproduces the field of science fiction as such, he is certainly not alone. Many of the nonfiction texts embraced by real-life advocates of post-human engineering, whether they prefer the name of cyborg, transhuman, immortalist, extropian, singularitarian, or some other avatar of superhumanity, also attend to science fiction as prefiguring real possibilities for the future and changing the way we think. For example, Norbert Wiener's The Human Use of Human Beings, Hans Moravec's Mind Children, Werner Vinge's The Coming Technological Singularity, K. Eric Drexler's Engines of Creation, Ray Kurzweil's The Singularity is Near, and other works of scientific futurology often engage with familiar science fiction novels to develop their theoretical arguments. More significantly, these nonfiction texts typically represent the post-human future, even as a real social goal or horizon for scientific research, in the mode of speculative fiction, locating the postal imaginary inside the formal conventions of literary fabulation. It is also the operating principle for a number of practicing post-humans in our own world, those daring adventurers who, anticipating the high-tech future to come, have rendered themselves post-human in advance. To be sure, they may be dead right now, or at least not quite alive, but from their own perspective, it is only a matter of time. Frozen in cryonic suspension, they wait patiently for an era in which sufficiently advanced technoscience will bring them back to life, delivering them to a new world, a life after life. Embracing the logic of science fiction, these chrononauts wager that any decision to become post-human cannot wait for the future, but must be made in the here and now. The discourse of cryonics makes no secret of its intimate relationship with science fiction. In fact, cryonics traces its conceptual origins to the pulp magazines. Robert Ettinger, the founding father of cryonics, first articulated the possibility of freezing dead bodies in the present and resurrecting them in the future in a 1948 short story called The Penultimate Trump, published in Startling Stories magazine. The story itself is narratively recursive as well, situating the origin of the idea for cryonics deeper in the history of speculative fiction. Incidentally, Gerald Feinberg also became an advocate of cryonics, endorsing the logic of those who had already chosen to go postal, those already hanging out in deep freeze. Indeed, he published another article in Scientific American and in Science magazine about the value of pursuing cryonics in anticipation of an inevitable future yet to come. This is not to overlook all the legions of transhumanists and extropians who perform the discourse of post-humanist science fiction on a daily basis, regardless of how committed they may be to signing up for cryonic suspension. Feinberg, it should be noted, did not choose this option for his own mortal remains, and this has been a source of consternation in the cryonics community. And so we might start to wonder the degree of commitment to a science fiction future that has, in fact, it is said, already transformed the present. Had it transformed it so much that there was no longer any need to enact it in the present. And this is indeed one of the instances in which science fiction anticipates or preempts the conditions and possibilities of actual scientific advances, even in the lives of those who advocate on their behalf. So, thanks.